Welcome to the 13th episode of Zero Basis Points podcast. We have a guest, our first guest, inaugural guest, Craig Uhlenkott. Welcome to the show.
Welcome, Craig.
Afternoon, gentlemen. Good to see you.
Good to see you, and thanks so much for joining us. So, Craig, we hyped you up a little bit, or a lot bit, I think, on the last podcast we had. Super excited to have you on. Obviously, George and myself, we have different interactions with you. We've met you at different conferences. George obviously worked with you at an event as well. Why don't you take a couple of moments to give a little introduction about yourself, and we'll dive into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, appreciate you both having me on. So, Craig Uhlenkott, been in the space for, going on 25 years. So I'm aging myself a little bit. Started early on managing product for a financial planning software called Financial Profiles. So for those that have been around long enough to remember that name and that logo, that's where it all started for me. Was fortunate to ride that train for, almost a dozen years through a couple of acquisitions. So another vendor that folks will probably remember, Navaplan, the old EISI folks from Winnipeg, came in and acquired us. And this happened, it was probably 2007, 2008. Was a great partnership, kind of two different kinds of financial planning products. One that was really highly customized. The other one was just really flexible and configurable, very modular based, but ultimately sold to private equity. And at that point, I knew my days were numbered. And again, just fortunate to have a good partner in my backyard at the time, TD Ameritrade. So
Nice.
TD had a pretty significant footprint here in San Diego where I live, had built integrations with them, had gotten to know the product team really well, as most vendors in this space did, and had an opportunity to jump in kind of in the early days when a lot of the custodians at the time were looking at how to really address, if you will, the whole Salesforce kind of dilemma, right? It's that 3,000-pound gorilla in the CRM space. Nobody really knew exactly how to handle them because Salesforce historically just hasn't done a lot of work to integrate with the tech stack. And so it made it really difficult for RIAs to adopt. And the ones that did, oftentimes and still do to this day, spent a lot of money configuring it and customizing it. So I'd like to say TD was the first to jump into the reselling game, but they weren't. LPL, gotta give them credit, was. But TD did it fundamentally different than not just LPL, but Schwab at the time. And so they brought me in to basically launch that product. I think they recognized, to their credit, that it wasn't as simple as just building a solution, kind of rolling it out there and letting the RAs adopt, right? They knew that they were going to have to support this over time, both with onboarding, sales, new product development. Like any good product, you have to continue to feed it. And they did for many, many years. And so I'm proud to say that was a really successful program for TD. I think we had somewhere in the neighborhood of like 350 firms that purchased through us, 4,000 users in total. We'll come back to this, I think, later, but I think one of the things that really set TD apart from a lot of the custodians was the way that they really approached technology and the way that they saw it as a means of growing assets. They didn't necessarily always think about it as a revenue stream directly, meaning, obviously they were a reseller, we were charging for the licenses, but the honest to God truth was TD was losing money on each license that they sold, and they were okay with that. But we can circle back to that because I do think it's relevant for our conversation. Did a number of things at TD in the close to 10 years that I was there. All in product, was responsible for launching Veil One Analytics, which was essentially our, if you want to think of it like a Tableau dashboard inside of the custodial platform that allowed advisors to generate a lot of different insights on their book of business. And then Schwab came in, acquired us, hung around for a while, realized I wanted to do something different, and the startup world came a-knocking. My good friend Tyler Ross was trying to figure out how to bring crypto to advisors. And so I was fortunate enough to jump on board there early on And I'm proud to say that we were the first to really stand up a solution that allowed an advisor to not just purchase, but manage crypto on behalf of their clients. Up until that point, the only options really were, Robinhood, Coinbase, where, client came to the advisor, said, hey, I want to buy some Bitcoin. The advisor couldn't do anything. They didn't really have any options. So enjoyed that for a couple of years. Obviously, the market wasn't quite ready for it, and we didn't see the mass adoption that we were hoping for. Um, and at that point, again, money was running dry. We had to pivot again, and ended up with an old partner of mine who's near and dear to, I think, both you gentlemen, our friend Oleg Tishkevich.
Yep.
He had started a company called Invent a few years prior, I think 2017. I joined a few years later and was really responsible for bringing that product to the RIAs. Up until my joining the firm, their tenants were primarily IBDs. They had a real estate client, but Oleg knew in order to really hit the market the way he wanted to, he had to find that sweet spot for the RIAs. And I'm proud to say I was a part of that. So I think, Invent's doing some really great things. Love what Oleg has built there, and enjoyed my time there until actually a former colleague of mine from TD, who had taken over the custody business at Axos, had approached me about jumping in to lead product for what is known as it's known as Liberty. It's the old Trust Company of America platform that many RIAs in this business have probably crossed paths with at one point or another. And I had a short stint there until, unfortunately, there was a reorg, and now I'm on to other things and looking at new opportunities. But excited to share more, and appreciate you again having me on to tell a little bit about myself and talk a little bit of the industry.
Awesome. No, love it. Thanks so much for that introduction. And I think one of the things that when we were talking with George around who do we want on the podcast, who do we want with us here, you were top of the list because of the experience and history that you bring to the table and what you've done. And George is a big fan of your time at TD and everything you guys did there. He always brings it up as an exemplar kind of what we should be doing at ARC as well, how we should be thinking about stuff, being at the bleeding edge of tech. Obviously, it's a different environment. You guys were doing stuff back then, which was, maybe cutting edge then. Now with AI, we see so much of it. There's bigger questions around, best of breed solutions, all in one vertical stuff. And we'll get into that a little bit, but excited to have you on. So thanks again, Craig. But if you would love to use that as a jumping point. We always talk about all the problems we have in the industry, and I'm sure you've seen your fair share of it. Kind of where are you seeing from your standpoint where we're heading next, having seen everything you've historically kind of been through?
Yeah, so context is important, right? So
Yep.
I'll sort of back up and just share just some history. And when I came into the space, this was early 2000s, so 2001, 2002. Believe it or not, and this was financial planning software. We were still shipping CDs, right?
Yeah.
Like that. Advisors literally um, had server rooms in their office, and they would install software onto those servers. We weren't the only ones doing it, obviously, but that was the standard. And I can recall going to industry conferences at the time, and the new cool thing was the cloud, and you got to get into the cloud. And advisors were resistant. They didn't want to give up their servers. They felt like they could protect their data better than anybody else.
Yep.
But not just that. I mean, if you think about this concept of open access, a lot of the custodians at the time were closed architecture, right? They didn't provide a lot of choice. They may have partnered with one or two financial planning tools or one or two CRMs, and it was take it or leave it. And I appreciate your comments on TD, because that really was what set them apart above all else, was this concept of open access.
Yeah.
And this idea that, look, there's a reason why RIAs choose the independent channel. They like choice, right? And you like what you like. This conversation, if you will, debate about best in breed. There isn't one right answer. That's just the honest to God truth. The best product is the one that you adopt,
Yeah.
right? Salesforce is great, but if you don't use it, you're wasting money. And so, there isn't one best solution. At the end of the day, it's what's best for you and what are your users ultimately gonna use day in and day out. And I think TD recognized that when others didn't. And so they went left when everybody else was going right. And that's ultimately what allowed them to grow. I mean, there was and I now see Altrist is now sharing this stat or a similar one, and I love it because one of the internal joys, if you will, while we were at TD that they would share with us was essentially a metric that captured positive net ACATs against all of their competitors. And I can't remember how many quarters it was. I want to say it was like 30 straight quarters, maybe longer. I don't know. But that just gives you some perspective in terms of they were taking more assets from every one of their competitors than they were giving back for a significant number of quarters in a row. I mean, it was incredible. And that one metric, really got the internal folks excited about what we were doing and where we were headed. The other thing that I think is really interesting about TD, where they were really at the forefront, is this concept of co-creation, right? Where they made it possible for those vendors that had an appetite to ultimately build a component, an app, if you will, and have it deployed within that TD framework, that ecosystem. That obviously was short-lived after the Schwab acquisition. They killed that, but that was before its time. And now you're seeing folks like Invent. I suspect others, whether it's Mile Marker or Jiffy, would say they're doing similar things because of all the advancements with microservices. It's now easier to do than ever before. But TD was there years ago and had built up quite a bit of excitement across the kind of the ecosystem of vendors. And probably one of the reasons George was so fond of us is not just the open access kind of architecture, but also the ability for us to really lean into those vendor partners as best we could to give them real estate and an opportunity to grow their own business, right?
Yeah.
So no,
That's like one of the reasons that really is like why I love the whole Veo One project, is because we were a small CRM company and we thought we were doing CRM better than everybody else. We're better than Redtail. We're better.
right.
But typically you're going up against getting approval to operate with a big system like TD Ameritrade. You're going up to trying to get LPL or Securities America to approve you. But TD Ameritrade in the RIA space is like, hey, just plug into it. And then they wrote a big article about us and we got a bunch of users. But then when we were talking to advisors and building client portals, we're saying just put your assets on TD Ameritrade. And like that was the conversation that we were having with advisors. Like it's just easier working with TD Ameritrade. And it still boggles my mind. I mean, I understand that the name of the game is to get the assets, but to sunset Veo One blows my mind.
Yeah.
Like how do they let that happen for all the consensus that goes into that? And what I remember very well, and it's on my Twitter feed, like when it was Twitter, like from like 2014, man.
It's okay. I still call it Twitter, George.
Yeah.
The village, the Veo Village was like 100 or 200 partners, like TV kiosk got their kiosk, and you're in the background of that picture. We didn't even know each other. And also, like, even as a vendor, we would get this gift basket every year. And I know people joke about gift baskets, but I swore like Marcel at TD Ameritrade, who was in charge of like the vendor relationships, like felt like he handpicked it and wrote the note. So it was, and that's this TD Ameritrade institutional. That's the kind of partner they were to us. And we were just like this small company in Westchester, Pennsylvania. So
yeah, well, and I think it speaks to, I talk about this a lot, is this idea of proximity, right? And I think, TD was good at it. There are a lot of folks in this space that are great at it. Getting proximate with your customers, with your partners, to understand their pain points, to understand their needs, and then to be responsive and actually go out and address them. TD was really good at that. And again, I'll call Altruist out. They're awesome at this. Like their ability to build in public, that's a superpower. I love that. We should see more of that across the space. And I give them a ton of credit. It's something that I think those that take it seriously, and it's not just lip service, right? Because look, we've likely all sat in either one side of the fence or the other an advisor panel, an ops panel of some kind. I did it a lot working for custodians over the years where we would bring in like our top, 20 clients every quarter and just have a session, a feedback session. What's keeping you up at night? How can we do better? And I can say TD honestly took that to heart and actually worked really hard to address as many of those pain points as they could. I've been at other places where those ideas, yeah, they get filed away and they get added to a roadmap, but they get deprioritized because, maybe they don't drive net new revenue, right? But but that's a shame to me. And I think as advisors, you really need to look at your vendor partners, your custodians, with a magnifying glass at times and say, what are you about? Are you here to listen to me, make me more productive, or is it about you and how you can suck more revenue out of me at the end
Yeah.
of the day? And it's unfortunate because I do think I'm not going to call them bad actors, but there are a lot of firms out there, right, vendors and custodians that, quite frankly, they're not about the advisor, not like you'd expect them to be, knowing that ultimately is what keeps them in business. So, anyways, I think that's one of the reasons why TD was sort of unique and special. I shared this story with you guys before we jumped on, but I'll say it again. When I was at TD, we had a Salesforce reselling program. That's why they brought me in.
Yeah.
The honest to God truth was we were losing money on every single license of Salesforce that we sold. And we were okay with that. Nobody was complaining internally. That was part of the strategy. The belief was if we provide good technology as cheaply as we can, right? You got to cover your costs as best you can. People understand that. Advisors understand that. But it wasn't about earning money on the licenses. That wasn't the goal. We always believed that if we gave the technology away, if we could, right? And in some cases we did, or if we gave it away at a low cost, meaning we ate some of it, we always believed we would always make out in the end because at the end of the day, the advisors would open that next account with us.
Yeah.
And I think at its peak, that reselling program had 350 RIAs, like 3 to 4,000 users. It was probably just in license revenue at 3 or 4 million. But again, and that was running at a loss. Like we were paying that and more to Salesforce just to keep that thing running. But again, it wasn't about the licenses. It was about the assets on the back end that we believed we would ultimately win by providing that better service, that better experience. And I think it proved out.
You would have saved money if you had deployed Grendel to those advisors.
Yeah.
But
I
and
got
Haik, I don't Haik, if you I don't know if you have another question, but I had another question if you don't mind if I ask it.
no,
Right,
go ahead. And
kind of
then I
right
was
on
gonna
that.
just talk about the proximity thing, but go ahead.
Yeah, actually talk about that. That's actually important. Yeah.
Well, no, I was gonna say Craig brought a great point of proximity, and then what I would call everything else he said after that, with the assets kind of coming on board, being like the value add service. And I think a lot of it helps me when I hear about stories like this with other builders, founders, any companies, success stories, etc. Because when I left Adipar and I started consulting and then building Arca, those were like the two things I wanted to do. One is like I have an existing call, recurring call with my clients every time. And it's about one, listening to them, but then taking the actionable item after, whether it's something I can do today or it's something that I can put into my roadmap later, and knowing they care enough about it to mention it in the conversation. I think that's where realistically a lot of founders and developers and builders will be more successful. And then the value add part of it, it's very close to me because it's not about squeezing every last piece of juice out of a deal as you can every time that someone waves a dollar for something they're willing to pay. It's about potentially, making something that's valuable to them, potentially giving away or not, covering your costs. As you said, I think most advisors are realistic when you tell them this is my cost. I just need to be, this percentage above this to cover my cost and not go out of business tomorrow. And they'll take that leap with you as long as you're transparent and honest. And it turns into a really beautiful relationship, in my opinion, for long standing engagements and things like that. So those were near and dear to my heart. But George, I'll let you go jump in with your question.
Um, the Salesforce thing that you were talking about. So CRM CRM's like, it's like talking about one of my kids. And so recently the idea has been that CRM is not, the most important tool that you need to buy, which is just ridiculous. But I do want to hear your opinion. But the reason I say that is like, if I'm an RIA, what's the next thing that I'm going to buy? And some of these like experts out there or consultants might say that like there's an idea of something greater than a CRM. And I used to say that about Grendel. I'd say it's more than a CRM. We used to call it WRM, wealth relationship management. Haik and I call it WORM, wealth and entity relationship management. And and if you want to get into a concept, that's one thing, but coming up with an idea, staying up late, coding the crazy idea, and getting it to an environment where you can show other people, getting investors and buy-in and advisors on board is a whole nother story. So if people are going to say that CRM shouldn't be at the center of the tech stack, I'm like, well, what is? And because what you're proposing doesn't exist today, and are you really going to build it, or are you just talking? Like, you going to stick with this? So just kind of curious. Like, I think that the CRM is the center of the tech stack. I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a loaded question, right? And I would say, depending on the firm, it probably depends, right? Like, I've seen a lot of RIAs do really good things with Salesforce. I'm just using them as an example where it truly is their hub, right? And they've made it work. That's not for everybody though. And I would even say nowadays it's more feasible than it's ever been for an RIA to stand up more of a bespoke experience, their own advisor and their own client portal, right? Like we mentioned Invent and Mile Marker and Jiffy and OneVest, and I'm sure I'm missing some others, right? Now, I think it's also fair to say those vendors are still likely looking at firms that are on the larger size of that
Yeah, I was
spectrum.
going to say, if you're building bespoke system, are you at 5 billion in your mind? Are you at 10 billion? To me, you're between 1 and 4,
Yeah,
maybe. Where you say,
if you would have asked me that question, George, 2 years ago, I would have said 2 billion and above. Now, I think it's reasonable, maybe 800 million and above. I don't know. Like,
I agree with the movement on that. Yeah.
I do think it's coming down market because, I mean, there's all sorts of tools. I mean, there's, as a product person, one of the joys of my job, one of the things that I had a real passion for was working with my design teams. And I can't tell you how many hours, days we would spend working on iterations of new UI. And I enjoyed doing it. So again, this was a passion, but it was time consuming. And now there are tools available to product teams that, not unlike what Haik you're doing with Arca, where you feed a prompt, right? Like you basically tell the system what front end to build, and it builds it in real time with working code.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that would be shippable code, although I've talked to a lot of CTOs that say the quality of code is actually pretty good. But what I would say is, where it would have taken me and a designer days, if not weeks, to mock up a Figma design, which, to be clear, is not working code,
Mm-hmm.
I can now, or a product person can now actually do on their own without a designer and get something that's 70% of the way there with working code that you could, and you could do that in hours, literally
Yeah.
hours. And you can hand that off to a designer, they can polish it, and then you and the designer can then take that to the developer with actual code that's already been written, and they can make, using those same prompt, improve the code, the quality of the code. So my point in that example is that I think the ability for vendors to offer up these more bespoke front end experiences is, again, more feasible than ever before, and the cost to develop it is just going to get smaller and smaller.
Yeah.
I'm a big believer in, going back to your question about the hub, I'm a big best in breed guy. I always have been. You're not going to get me off that hilltop. There are a lot of people out there that like to talk about these vertically integrated tech stacks where they're kind of the most in one. And I think for some RIAs that probably makes some sense, right? And I would say it's probably for the smaller size RIAs that would find that more appealing
Yeah,
because they're not wrong. Building integrations is tough and it's not perfect, right? We have a long way to go still. But again, what I've learned from being in business for 25 years is that advisors like choice. And when I think about these most in ones, I tend to think about limits in terms of customizations and flexibility. They're not as focused. How can they be on any one piece of that tech stack? Because they're trying to do 10 different things, not two or three. And so it's just inherent in that they are going to lag behind those vendors that are more focused, right, on a particular solution suite, right? And then if I'm an RA, I think about risk, vendor risk.
of course.
Do I want to put all my eggs in one basket? My preference is no. I'm a big believer in RA should think about we will always be data dependent, right? You can't run your business without the data, but you should never be vendor dependent. Meaning, if I have to change out my PMS system, granted, it's an ordeal. I don't want to have to do that, but I can and still continue to operate my business. If I need to change out my CRM, I can, right? So I would rather spread my risk because look, consolidation is hitting all parts of the business, not just the RAs. It hits the vendor side too. So look at your vendors. Like, and I'm not going to pick on people, although maybe I will a little bit. Like Black Diamond, SS&C. Like, what's the likelihood that somebody's going to come and buy SS&C? Highly unlikely. Not going to happen,
Zero point
right?
zero. Yeah.
So you kind of know who you're dealing with. You either like them or you don't. That's your choice. But one of these other vendors who hasn't yet sold, it's only a matter of time. Look, I've been there. Like it's one of the viewpoints that I think I bring to any of these conversations. I've been on the vendor side. I've been on the custodial side, right? I've seen again both sides of the aisle, and it's only a matter of time before your vendor does get acquired by somebody, and then all bets are off. Who knows what they're going to do with it, right?
For sure.
So
And
Craig, do
so
you mitigate that risk with like, and I know you're about to keep talking, but do you mitigate that with staying best of breed and then double mitigate it by having a data lake? I would love what your thoughts on that as like a risk mitigation measure. Yeah,
yes, and I think this idea of a data lake, I think we need to be more specific, right? Because you
please.
can, I'll use the term rent. Maybe that's not however other people like to refer to it as that, but like I can partner, again, I'll use the names, mile marker, invent, just because they're two of the prominent ones. I can rent a data lake, basically, have them service it for me. Um, and I think for a lot of RAs, that's probably good enough. If I'm a bigger, I don't know what the number is, 10 billion or north of that, I probably I want to cut the check to Amazon. I don't want, Invent or Model Marker cutting it for me, right? And so again, I think it depends on the RIA, but yes, owning your data is important, but there's different ways to solve that problem, right? It doesn't always mean having to go out and do it yourself. There are partners out there that are doing good work in that space, and lean into those folks. Absolutely.
I think it's a two-pronged approach. One of them is what you just described, having that best in breed across what systems you use. The second thing, which we're just saying data lake, but it's more so just having the records of everything you're using in those systems. Now, whether you own it or you rent it or whatever, depending on your size, how much technical capabilities you have or you want to maintain, etc. One of the interesting things that I think we've run into is a lot of folks were talking about data lakes, not understanding what it was for. It was just like, I want the data lake because everyone else is talking about it. But realistically, this is a de-risking tactic for you. One, two, it's going to give you the ownership of the data that a lot of these systems aren't going to allow you to have. Like I remember our time at Adapar, they would say, "Hey, it's your data," but guess what happened when you turned it off? They just gave you a large Excel file CSV of all your data and said, "Go." Now, how are you going to onboard it to another PMS system for portfolio management, for performance reporting? Good luck, right? That's where I would come in a lot of places where I would consult and help clients normalize the data and move it over. But realistically, they're so afraid of that happening. And I think technology has a long ways to go to make it more open source, to say, look, I can't do this stuff. You want to go tomorrow? I'm going to help you just send that data over to your data lake, and then you're going to move it over to something else. That conversion piece is such a scary negotiation tactic as well, where you're like, the cost for conversion can be so astronomical that you might not ever leave. And I think that's why very horrible, oh well, I wouldn't say horrible, but not great software, it still has users till today because they're just afraid to leave, right? And
Yeah.
that's a big one.
Well, and I'll even use one of my own personal experiences, and I'll go back and use the TD example. And this is unfortunate, and it's one of the things that I still to an extent carry with me today. It makes me feel really bad for the advisors that were impacted. So when Schwab acquired TD, they made the business decision to shut down that reselling channel. And so, yeah, and we weren't 350 firms at that point, because it's also fair to say that some of those firms, because if you go back some years, remember Salesforce decided to get into the different verticals, into the different industries. So they launched Financial Services Cloud.
Yep.
And so there were a lot of firms that decided to switch for their own reasons, and they had every right to do so. But one of the I guess the challenges when you buy tech through a trusted partner, these advisors trusted TD to keep this thing going, but Schwab made the decision, and they had every right to do so, to cut off that program. So all of those firms were forced to migrate away, right? And it's unfortunate. Again, to this day, I still feel awful about that. There wasn't anything I could do. But it's a fact of life. It's one of the things that I think advisors, and it's probably why a lot of them are skeptical to change, and jump from system to system, because you just don't know what you're going to get, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and your hand might be forced. You didn't do anything wrong. You were working with what was given to you, but now the business that you partnered with has made a tactical decision, and now you're forced to respond, right? And so it does. It puts people into a bind. So I would just say it's one of the inherent risks of our business, and there's no way to avoid them, I don't think, unless you build all your own tech, which I would highly recommend nobody do.
Yeah.
But it's just part of the business, and unfortunately, we all get impacted one way or the other eventually.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that, having been a part of this wave, I guess you can call ARCA being part of the AI wave that's coming on. It's all these new tech that comes in and then starts getting gobbled up by some of the larger players, and then you have some that have been independent, and then another new wave comes in. And so it's kind of like each time, like you said, who do you pick? You got, and it's an inherent part of our business because there's going to be always new traction with new tech, like the note takers. I foresee consolidation happening there for sure, because there's too many of them, and we've always called it with George, it's like a race to the bottom, who's going to be the most accurate, the cheapest, and then you're going to have to tie yourself to a CRM. And then now, because of we're going back to what you said, where it's more feasible to build quicker, a lot of these CRMs are going to say, hey, I'll just build my own. Why am I going to even buy, right? So there's going to be this competition, and I kind of, frankly, I like it, because I like when competition leads to innovation, and you have to be at the bleeding edge to do stuff. But I think, as you said, our market is prone to this on the wealth management space, and we're going to see less and less of these guys maybe pop out as more consolidation happens, and then it's going to be the newer thing that comes next.
Yeah, well, and I would going back to that comment about proximity, right? Like, one of the other things I remember fondly, and look, Hike, you're a good example of this because you're a young entrepreneur, and George, you'll appreciate this, but back when I started, a lot of these tech founders didn't just work on the business, they worked in the business, right? Like, literally, like Brian McLaughlin, dear friend, he was coding and he was running Redtail CRM at the same time,
Yeah.
right? And he was also the guy working the booths at conferences. Like, you don't see as much of that anymore because the industry has grown up, right? And that's expected. Those are natural progressions when a space and industry has matured. But I will go back to the issue that can create for some is, now you have ownership who isn't intimately involved in the space, right? Because they're just running the business. They don't know how to get proximate, or they don't care to. And so they make these decisions, which unfortunately sometimes have unintended or intended consequences. But I will say there are still a lot of good young founders like yourself and others. Jason, like the guy's running a successful custodian, but he's as active as anybody, as I can
Great.
see in the space and on social. And so I think that's great. So I would say that stuff matters. If I was an RI looking at a vendor partner, I would look for founders that are active, involved, and engaged. Like that, to me, that's meaningful. Doesn't guarantee that things are going to work out, but ultimately I would see that as a net benefit.
Yeah, I
Great.
think it means you haven't checked out yet, that the founder's still heavily involved, and you can still get features into their head, you
Right.
know. So yeah, once they're not at the conferences anymore. Craig, one of the things, like, when I keep thinking back to what I loved about Veo One, and when we think about guys like us that have been in the industry as long as we have, me and Craig like 20 years, it's the idea of moving from one performance system or one CRM to, or one financial planning tool to another. Like, we understand the process. To an RIA, that's got to be terrifying. But when you talk about proximity, like when you assemble your best of breed solution that we talk about, and I think we're all in agreement on best of breed. Um, but it's got to be those solutions that you're choosing have to make it easy to come on board with them and to leave them as well. Like, the last thing we need is another marriage. So and when we built Grendel, it was easy to convert your data in, and it was easy to take it out. Like, we weren't going to twist your arm and make that part difficult. So even I think that kind of idea of holding data hostage, or Hike, like you were saying, Adapar gives you a file that you're like, dude, I have to pay an engineer $200,000 to figure this
Yeah.
thing out. That's just not cool. So when you talk about proximity, or just partners where, somebody like Brian McLaughlin is at the conference, like, he doesn't want an advisor coming up complaining to him that it's hard to get their CRM back up. So he'll
Right.
make sure there's a button inside where you can kind of click and do that yourself. So, I think it's important for those founders to be at the conferences to make sure that the support at their companies is not inundated with stupid requests from advisors who just need things like this.
Yeah, I guess what I would offer back up in response is I think most vendors, and I'm being specific vendors, not custodians here, but I think most vendors understand that. And so the APIs have come a long way. Obviously, still have a long way to go. Some are better
Yep.
than others. But generally speaking, I do think the flow of information and an agreement between the vendor and the advisor that it's the advisor's data, right? This kind of debate, if you will. It's not even
Right.
a debate in my mind.
Well, throw custodian into the bucket of thinking as if they're a vendor too.
Yeah, well, but not all custodians think alike, right?
Right.
They may not say this publicly, but I would venture to guess they see the data as theirs, not the RIAs. And that
Right.
shame on them for that. I wholeheartedly disagree with
And
that,
they
right?
don't make it easy to get to play with the data. Sometimes you're fighting with a custodian for cost basis.
Yeah, and I could see a future, unfortunately, where some may choose to charge for that access, which I think is just a terrible idea. And I hope that's not where the industry is headed. But I mean, it's been that way on the BD side for a long time,
Yeah.
which is why I love the independent channel, right? It's always been sort of, it's your data, advisor, do with it what you will. Not so on the BD side, right? Very different.
Right.
But here's what I would also offer up, and it kind of goes back to something we hit on earlier around sort of these vertically integrated solutions, these most in ones where it's like these frenemy kind of games, right? Where okay, I might have an API, but if I build my own CRM, do I really want to build a tighter integration with the other CRMs in the space? Probably not, right? Like it used to be that you picked a lane, you stuck to it. You had your enemies, you had your friends. Now those lines have gotten blurred, and there's a lot of folks blurring those lines. Clearly, I just think again it would be a shame if in the future we see some of those more vertically integrated solutions begin to make it more difficult to integrate with other solutions that they may now see as competitors, right? I think that would be a shame. I'm not calling anyone out in particular. I'm just saying, it's a fact of life. And could that be a reality? And to a certain extent, maybe it is today. RIAs would know this better than me because they're probably having some of these conversations with their
For sure.
vendors. But
Yeah.
but again, like that's one of the reasons why I love this concept of best in breed is that the lines aren't as blurry. And I have a CRM, a financial planning tool, I have a custodian. I need you three to all talk and work together, right? And again, it does give more, I guess, credence to, the other side of that argument, right? Of saying, well, why even mess around with integrations? Just get everything from us. So I get the argument. I do. And I understand the value, right, that they promise. I just don't know if it makes up for, some of the inherent risks that I see in going all in with one vendor, right? And again, no one size fits all. Whatever works for your firm. I just think there's less risk, greater opportunity going best in breed and assembling, the tools that work best for you and your team at the end of the day.
That's awesome. No, I think that that type of approach is one that I would assume a lot of the independent RIAs want to take. And I think they're confined into the limitations of some of these vendors that the most in one, all in one solutions try to kind of, uphold and say, hey, here's where you should be. You want to use something else. I'm not so sure if I should release that data, etc. But I think what speaks volumes is if you're so good that the RIA is not looking elsewhere for everything you're doing. But even if they are, if you give them the opportunity, they go somewhere and still like what you're doing and come back to it. And I think that's where it's a little scary maybe for founders and some of these companies to do that. But that's what you should potentially do. Like imagine you're using a system that has the CRM and the note-taking capability. You go out there and start using Zox and you say, I actually like what they're doing better. I'm still going to use the CRM function you have, but I'm using Zox for the recording, etc. Bring it all in one. I'm much happier. I'm happier with you independently. I'm happier that you work together. And I think a lot of folks in that space might be too afraid. Hey, what if they start doing, something else? And that's really the conundrum, right? Some AI note taker is going to say, I'm going to start building CRM features. And can I draw this client that way? And I think we were talking about Wealthbox. John Rourke posted the vampire picture on LinkedIn. Like, a lot of these AI note takers are sucking the blood from the CRMs because they need that lifeline to live, or else where are you landing this data? Where does it go? So
Yeah, and credit to John, big fan of his and what he's done for the space. He loves to poke the bear and I applaud it, right? It makes the space more interesting. We need more of that, not less.
yeah,
But I would also say, look, I mean, we're not naive, right? I think the future for a lot of these AI tools is likely to encroach on the CRM space, right? It's already happening. And so, that's going to create some friction. And to John's credit, his team is now building similar features that, allow him to compete better with some of those. So, yeah, I think that the next few years are going to be really interesting. I was at Future Proof a few weeks back. And one of the things I'm most excited about, because let's just be honest, like this industry is not known for being forward thinking, right? We don't move quickly, right? Historically. I can remember a day when DocuSign wasn't seen as a compliant way of grabbing a client signature, right? Like DocuSign was a big deal, right?
yeah,
And now we want to get away from DocuSign because it's clunky and everyone wants click to consent and straight through, which I fully endorse. But I think the next 2 or 3 years are going to show us a very different industry in a good way because we're moving at a speed that I've never witnessed before. And when you move quickly like that, you break some things. That's fine. That's to be expected. So I do think you need to sort of experiment. You need to be willing to sort of dabble. What I used to always tell advisors, and again, always taking more of a consultative approach to a lot of these conversations, because oftentimes an RI would come to a custodial partner and just ask the question, well, what CRM should I use, right? Like, I can't tell you how many times I got that question. And I would honestly fire back and say, whatever one you're going to adopt, right? You have to make a decision. Like, you have to have a CRM. The worst thing you can do is do nothing, right? And so I've always been a proponent of you've got to continue to, if it's ideation and just experimentation and trying new things, but you have to continue to move forward. Advisors share the same concept with their clients. Like they're trying to get their client to take an action, move money, invest in some new strategy, whatever it is. And they're doing everything they can to bring about that enough conviction to actually make a change, do something, right? Don't do nothing. And so I would say the same should hold true for any of these AI tools or any new technology, right? Like one of those I was sharing with you, Haik, from Future Proof. I'll give them a plug. I don't know them well, but I saw enough to know that they're pretty interesting. Sherpa's Wealth, I think, if I'm getting that one right, kind of building financial plans, just feeding it prompts. Pretty cool stuff. They've
Yeah.
probably got a ways to go still, but I love the concept. We'll see what it looks like in 2 years after they've had a bit of runway. But definitely, like sitting on the sideline isn't an option in my mind, right? Like you have to be aggressive to an extent. You've got to be willing to take chances and, set up a small pilot. Doesn't have to be all your users, right? Like find a cohort of people that like new stuff
Yeah.
and are comfortable experimenting and try things out. And as they say in product development, if you're going to fail, fail fast and move on, right? There's nothing wrong with failure so long as you learn from it. So, I think if I was saying anything, it's like doing nothing is the worst choice. You've got to do something. So go out there, look at the various options, make a choice. You can always pivot and pick another one later. It's not the end of the world.
Yeah. That segues really well into a question I would love to ask you and probably any future guest. What are the things that you love about our industry, and what are the things that you hate? And I mean, you talked a little bit about it being slow moving. Maybe that is what you hate, so you answered it already. But if there's something even worse, feel free to throw that in.
Man, that's a good question. What do I
Put
what do
them
I
on the spot.
yeah, what do I dislike about the space? Um, Man, well, look, it come far enough along in terms of like the APIs and the way that we pass data around? Certainly not. I mean, the fact that so much of the industry still runs on flat files is ridiculous. I think everybody acknowledges that. So that's frustrating. Um, do I wish that there were more vendors willing to build, as I see it, more serious partnerships, right? We all get focused on our own tech stack, if you will, right? Like I've got a feature list a mile long that my customers need me to deliver. And so anything that takes me away from that, if I have to go build some integration with you, it's a distraction for some, right? And so there have been attempts in the past, for those of us that have been around a long time, your silver bullet's a good example where we tried to build kind of a data standard, didn't work out so well. But I do wish that the vendor community came together more often and in different ways. That being said, there are a lot of vendors doing a lot of great work together, and that should be applauded and recognized. So it's not that stuff doesn't happen. I'm just saying I'd like to see more of it.
Yep.
In terms of the things that I love, I as I said before, I like the speed at which the industry seems to be moving is a good thing. It's moving quicker on the technology front than it ever has. And that's why I do believe in the next 2 to 3 years, things are going to look a lot different in a good way. Yeah, I mean, aside from that, I don't think we've done enough. I guess I'm going back to the negative. Like,
Yeah.
I don't think we've done enough as an industry to really bring financial services, financial wellness to, kind of that lower end of the spectrum of, folks with investable assets. I was sort of going back and forth. I'm not going to name names, but there was an RA launch this week that's bringing direct indexing and tax loss harvesting, which is great. And it's a kind of a hybrid model. So digital front end, I'm sure it'll be very slick. But I think, don't quote me on this, but I think their minimum is $1 million in investable assets.
Not surprised. Yeah.
Right? And that's unfortunate. And it not so much a knock on them as it is the industry, right? Like we've still not figured out. And I think again, if I'm going to give flowers, and again, I'm not paid by Altruist, but this is one area where Jason, I think, shines, is he's on this mission to bring advice down further to those that really need it, and that should be applauded again. And so I'd like to see more of that. But I don't know. I mean, aside from those things, I love all the new vendors that are popping up.
Yeah,
I know people complain about the Kitchens map being too big, and it is, but I love competition. I'm not a big believer in less is more. I think more is better, right? Like you need to give people choice and options. It makes us better. And I think ultimately it's good to have competition, healthy competition. And I think in certain areas, custodial being one of them, as we said, you're starting to see some of that, which is good. Apex is doing some great things. I suspect Trade Pumar with Robinhood will do some good things. Um, you know, I'd like to see some of the other pieces of the tech stack. I feel like, I obviously called out Sherpa's Wealth earlier. Yeah, I'd like to see more planning tools, newer ones with different ideas, different methodologies, change the game, because we've got a couple of old legacy players that, quite frankly, have huge market share and don't always feel as though they're being as innovative as they can be.
agree.
So yeah, I would like to see some of these different sort of verticals be challenged a bit more, and I do think AI is going to help with that, because I think one of the things you'll see is the moat, or the perceived moat. The idea of building a planning tool just seems immense, and for years it was. But with AI, I think you can close that gap fairly quickly, and hopefully that will bring about new entrants into that space and others, because what a lot of these legacy players lean on is, hey, I've got a 20-year head start.
Yeah,
I've got a feature list that's a mile long. It's going to take you 5 years to catch up, and while you're catching up, I'm building the next mile of features. So I think that gap is going to get smaller and smaller with a lot of these advancements. So I'm excited about that.
that's awesome. It's never. I feel like every time we talk, there's so much to be said, Craig, and with George too. We'll start on the topic and we'll go on, and it's like we'll obviously have to have you on as a guest again, because I think all the insights you bring, the experience, everything you've done in this space has been really awesome. So we'd love to have you on again.
Yeah,
We'd
that could
love
be
to
like
kind
our
of go
first,
dig
like,
deeper.
kind of extended 4-hour podcast with Greg.
I know.
I would have no problem. I was looking, I'm like, already an hour. Ooh.
I know. I'm
You just
really
start
surprised.
getting into the real stuff, start open up some API handbook,
Well, we can't
No,
scare
but
everyone off the bat right away. I
right.
think there will be. This is a safe space, Craig. So in the future, I mean, we'd love to have you on to kind of talk about everything else you're seeing out there, what you're going to be doing hopefully soon for a lot of RAs. I think some of the stuff that I've seen you put out there about how you're thinking about the space, I'd love for others to really be thinking in that same manner. And so, for our millions of listeners and the RAs that are out there, I mean, feel free to reach out to Craig. I think he has a wealth of knowledge with him about how to set this stuff up. And doing nothing is really probably the biggest problem. Like, that should be what you guys should be scared of. Regardless, even from the AI space, when I talk about it, you need to have your ducks in a row for you to even use a lot of the AI, whether it's the data, whether it's the process or your system. So, having the experience that Craig brings to the table, I think is awesome. It's not like I'm being sponsored or paid by Craig to do it, but I'll plug Craig in because I think he's an awesome person in this space. But
Yeah.
Craig, appreciate you being our first inaugural guest, and hopefully looking forward to having you more on here.
Love it. Appreciate you both. Hopefully I added at least one new listener to your podcast.
Yeah,
Thousands.
thousands. That's it.
I love it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you again on the Zero Basis Points podcast. Talk
All
soon.
right, John. Take care.
See you guys.